Have you ever thought about whether your marine science, conservation, or policy career is having the impact that you want on the ocean? For instance, I turned to podcasting about how to protect the ocean because I wanted to reach out to individual people to tell them about what's happening with the ocean and how they can help. I decided that I would stop working for the government in a nice cushy job working in the Great Lakes to follow this endeavor, and I am not the only one. In today's episode, I speak with Shannon Constantino Roche about chasing impact throughout her career. Shannon has had quite the career in national and international policy, but now works as a chief strategic officer for a startup company called Finless Foods that offers plant-based and cell-cultured seafood alternatives. We're going to talk and find out what drove her to continue to pivot towards different career choices and how she ended up as a CSO of a startup. That's on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and how you can live for a better ocean by taking action. And today's podcast is a great one. I haven't done an interview in a while. I'll be probably doing a little bit more interviews as we go forth as we go forth in 2023, I guess I should say. But this interview was really, really fun. I got contacted by, as a podcast, I should mention, as a podcaster, you get contacted quite a bit from people and companies who are trying to get people on other podcasts, guests on other podcasts. They could be authors, they could be, they could be business owners, they could be scientists. It doesn't matter. Oftentimes, they're just sort of blanket templated emails that have nothing to do, like the guest has nothing to do with the podcast that they're trying to pitch, and I ignore them. However, this one I had trouble ignoring. When I first read that, there's a company out there that's doing plant-based seafood and cell-cultured seafood, I have to admit, at the beginning I was a little skeptical. Then I got to thinking, I'm like, this is a new avenue that people are talking about. This is an industry that is happening, and this is something that I should get to know more, and I should find out more. And man, I am glad I did, because the person who I interviewed today, Shannon, it has quite the background. And my worry about taking on people who are doing business with sort of, I guess, with impact is I worry that they're more business oriented and more want to promote the company rather than talk about the industry, talk about sort of the transparency and the impact and so forth, and talk about themselves as well. And I'm glad to say that when I met Shannon right off the bat, I knew it was going to be an interview where we found out more about her and what led her to work with Finless Foods, the company that we're talking about today, but also why and how her career led her up to that. A lot of the times, and I, as I mentioned in the pre-intro, I went through the same thing. I worked in, marine biology. I worked for consulting. I worked for NGOs. I worked for government. I can never really, there was always something more that I wanted, and I can never really figure it out until I started podcasting. And even when I was podcasting, I wasn't sure if this is what I really wanted to do. And then I started to hear back from people, and I started to hear back, hey, I'm really happy that I found your podcast. I'm an avid listener, and your work, the work that you do to communicate science and ocean news, has really helped me get a better perspective on what's happening with the ocean and how I can help. That's what I wanted. That's the reason why I started the podcast, because a lot of my family and friends didn't really know what to do or what was going on in the complexities that were involved. So I said, I'm going to put a platform that does this and have people on that are working towards helping the ocean. But I found like I had to go into the for-profit business to do that, right? To be able to do that the way I wanted. Organizations weren't really taking me on. They didn't really go with my pitches. Some tried, it just didn't really work out. And so now what I've created is something that's been very fulfilling for me, to the point where I've actually gotten a job that's apart from this so that I can do this more and feel financially free to do this. Now, Shannon today, who we're talking to, is a chief strategic officer, or chief strategy officer at Finless Foods. and where they work together to build a future for seafood where the ocean thrives. So Shannon has a lot of different, like a lot of different background. She has a BS in political science from Santa Clara University, followed by a JD in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School. She's also worked, she was a CNOS fellow, which she talks about today. She's worked in positions with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. She's also worked with NOAA, various NGOs, and as an international consultant and technical ocean policy expert. But in the U.S., Asia, Africa. She's also worked in Italy. She's worked on the bluefin tuna files. So she's very interested in tuna, which this company actually focuses on. So there's always been something that tied her from one position to another, even one industry to another. And you're going to find that. And we titled it. It was really interesting when I first talked to her. She's like, yeah, I've been chasing impact my whole career. And that's why I wanted to title it that way. I asked her if I could use it. She said yes. And I thought it was a really good way of putting this podcast together and planning out this story, is her story in chasing impact, and how you can even tell the passion that she has for this company and working with this industry and working in policy to help this company and to help the industry and to provide an alternative to seafood, whether it's aquaculture, whether it's wild caught seafood. It's all these different types of alternatives to provide a diversity. And we're going to talk about that, why that's important in this interview. So without further ado, here is Shannon Constantino-Rausch talking about her motivation in chasing impact throughout her career and how she ended up at Finless Foods and what she's doing there. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Shannon, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about chasing impact?
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for having me. I certainly am.
Awesome. I'm super excited about this interview. We've been trying to get this interview going for a couple of months. There's been a lot of travel. There's been a little forgetfulness on my part, which I apologize for. But this is going to be really exciting because we're here to talk about a company that you're working with right now. It's a startup. It's called Finless Foods. It's essentially plant-based and cell-cultured seafood, essentially, is what it is. And we're going to get into that entire explanation. But what we're also going to be talking about is you started in a very different career path, in the environmental law career path, and you ended up in business and doing something that will have a big impact, but not in the traditional sense that we think when we first enter the environmental sector. So this is going to be a fun interview because I'm looking forward to seeing sort of your thought process in this, because it's a thought process I've been through. So I want to see how it differs, but also a lot of our audience members are going through as well. So I'm looking forward to this. So we're going to get into that right now. Shannon, before we get into everything, why don't you just give us a little brief history of like who you are and what you do?
Yeah. Well, I'm Shannon. I'm technically the Chief Strategy Officer at Finless Foods right now, but I will kind of walk you through how I got here in my journey. I love that you said chasing impact, because that's often how I explain it to folks when they ask me. And I do get this question a lot, like, how did you end up here from where you started? I think one thing I always like to kind of mention to start off is just like the origin story, because it's weird. How did you get so passionate about tuna? I grew up in the Bay Area in California, close to the coast, and my father actually was really passionate about ocean conservation and, bizarrely, but there's a backstory, global tuna fisheries and the relationship of the tuna industry to the ocean, etc. And so I grew up having a library of ocean and fisheries books in my house, and having a membership to like the Monterey Bay Aquarium and going to various kind of other aquariums very frequently. And I think that really just seeded my passion in these issues. And I think from early days, I knew I was really a systems change thinker. So I was just naturally drawn to the policy ecosystem rather than the sciences. Like, how do we structure the laws and regulations in which we govern the ocean? Weirdly, I probably was already passionate about that in junior high. And so I think
it.
I always knew I wanted to study environmental law, and that was like a focus for me. Not just in high school, but even in college, that was like my guiding light. And so I studied political science. I focused my thesis in school around international tuna fisheries. Because of my passion for sort of international fisheries and ocean, I specifically decided to go to Vermont Law School to study sort of law, but also get a master's in environmental policy, where I was lucky enough to actually be able to specifically take courses on like international ocean governance and international trade, et cetera. And that really kickstarted my career kind of getting into the Canal Sea Grant Fellowship in the United States, which is pretty, exactly. It's pretty well known. It's a really amazing opportunity. For anyone listening that has heard about it or hasn't heard about it, I highly recommend looking into it. So I started my career in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so NOAA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I was in the Office of Law Enforcement, which was really a cool experience.
Yeah.
And I was in that office working on international issues, specifically like combating IUU fishing. So I was lucky enough to sort of start my career in the government. I felt like I was really loving that international work, but the way I wanted to kind of take that was more in the capacity building approach. So working with international governments, ministries on their fisheries policies, and specifically on, again, combating IUU. So I spent some time in Italy studying, again, this thread of passion for the global tuna industry and fisheries management was kind of my North Star. And so I spent 2 summers in Italy learning about the sort of traditional bluefin tuna fishery, which is actually a tuna trap. I ended up getting the job I was waiting for to go work in Africa on international fisheries. So serving as kind of a legal expert on a lot of intergovernmental projects, the UN, the EU, et cetera. And I think going back to this thread of chasing impact, I felt like I was really able to think about these complex issues and frankly draft a lot of reports and legal language, but I still felt like there was more I could do, and I was really confined in this legal expert role working in intergovernmental like aid. And so I came back to the United States to try my hand at more advocacy work. Actually, there was a brief stop where I decided maybe local government work, I could point my finger more to things that I directly impacted and achieved. And so I did some brief work post-Hurricane Sandy in New York City and sort of Long Island around zoning. But again, I just, when you have a passion for something, and I feel like I was really missing my international fisheries work. So I moved back to the NGO space. I tried my hand at sort of policy work there. And at the time, this is where the personal and professional sometimes collide. My partner, who's still my partner today, worked in the sort of design and innovation space in New York City. And I think I had my eyes open to an entire new world of addressing environmental impact. And I was even just realizing that there was so much work being done on areas where my friends were overlapping, like plastic, right? Rethinking how do we use ocean plastic. And there were companies coming of age, and there was all this industry work. And my friends in the policy world almost knew nothing about it.
Really?
And yeah, it was really interesting. And I was realizing that there was this big silo, and I got really passionate about, okay, I've tried policy for systems change, right? But it's very structured, it's very bureaucratic, it's very slow. And I just felt like I wasn't digging into the solutions in a way that I really had hoped to. Earlier in my career, as many of us are, right? You're young and you're hungry and you just want to like shake things up. And so I started doing some work in the innovation space and realized that I'm quite a builder. And it made my past roles make a lot more sense. Like even in the government, I found this small program where we were building a network, and in the consultancy, I was trying to build capacity building projects. And I realized that was something I wanted to try my hand at. So when I ended up having an opportunity, I was the director of policy and campaigns at an NGO, and one that actually focused on innovation. So I was already in my career making these moves towards that. And I got to have my hand in both pots. I got to work on big ocean campaigns like combating deep seabed mining. At the same time, I got to support all these really awesome entrepreneurial, like oceanpreneurial ideas, from plastic and reuse to fisheries. But there's one company specifically that stood out for me. It was Finless Foods. One, they were working on bluefin, which was the very beginning passion area of mine. That's been the thread throughout my career and why I went to Italy. But also they were looking at this how do we create an entirely new industry? And for me, like kind of a policy nerd, what is the system and framework that would govern this new industry?
Right.
All around figuring out new solutions to the challenges we've been looking at for fisheries policy and fisheries management throughout my whole career. And a mentor of mine really was like, this is a one-time opportunity to get your hands in on something this exciting, this new, and that has this much potential to create an entire new way of addressing impact. Like, jump into it. And so I did, and that's where I am today. The Chief Strategy Officer at Finless Foods. So a little bit circuitous maybe to some, but like very intentionally laid, all with this theme of how do I attack impact from new and innovative ways to try and see more realized potential, if you will.
You know, we've had very different careers, you and I, but the thought process is very similar. I felt the same. I worked for Fisheries and Oceans here in Canada, and I felt like although I enjoyed the job and I enjoyed the people I worked with, I wasn't having that same impact that I had in my head. And I didn't know exactly what that impact was going to be until I started podcasting, until I started to see more of an individual impact, like an impact on individual listeners when they started to give me feedback and whatnot. And that still drives me today. And I just think it's interesting how throughout your entire career, although you see the signs now, like in hindsight, you're like, oh yeah, well, this is why I chose this. And this is why I kept wanting to do something different and something new and innovative. And now you're here and you can look back, you're like, this makes sense. Like, this is all driving me. Did you ever get to a point where you're like, I wish I had figured it out sooner, or do you think this was the path that you were supposed to take?
No, and it's funny, right? I always tell folks this because there's this assumption that you never felt like it was clear to you the whole time. And definitely I felt at each of those changes, I felt lost, right?
Right.
Or frankly, you're like making big bets and you're hoping that your bets play out and you're like, I just feel called to this thing.
Absolutely. But
half the people I know are calling me crazy. The other half are like, it's so you just have to keep going. And you're kind of looking at this coin toss, like which way do I go? Stay in the tried and true, like push the boundaries. I'm not sure what it's going to look like. So I definitely did not know it was going to play out this way. I do think there's an element of like fate and like things happening at the right reason, or just things unlocking things maybe that, you know, if you hadn't done that, other things wouldn't have been unlocked.
Right.
So I definitely feel like each of those steps gave me insight into the next step. And frankly, I leverage skills that I gained in each of those steps every day in my job. I'm so grateful. Like, why I'm able to have such a varied role is because of each of those steps I'd taken and the different like people I met, skills I met, perspective I gained. So I think especially for folks who are questioning their career changes, I think you just have to, there is an element of a leap of faith.
Yeah.
And when we say chasing impact, I think there's this perception, especially when I guest lecture, folks ask me like, do you mean you're making the most impact? And it's not even that. It's really the impact that resonates with you, right? Because these are all tools in the toolbox. No part of me is like folks who are working at the government are giving any less impact. As much as I think I learned from myself the types of work I like to do and the impact. And I really like to be that person who's pushing the boundary, exploring new ways of thinking, trying to create systems change, in some ways trying to peel back the onion and reframe the way we're trying to achieve things. That's definitely very specific to me, and other folks are different and their impact journey is going to be different. So I think it's really just figuring out what makes you the happiest and what makes you feel the most fulfilled is really more what chasing impact is, rather than like, I've unlocked this quote unquote most impact.
Yeah, true. I think that's a great point you bring up. And I think it's also, you know, as we hear your story, I feel and I hear it as a success story. You've been successful at attaining each of these positions, each of these new positions, and driving down, and sometimes very different from the last. And I see it as a success story. But in every success story, there are challenges along the way. And I see those challenges in being in the decisions to making those transitions, or even the transition itself to a new role. I mean, going from sort of like school to NOAA, in the Canos Fellowship, and then traveling a lot through there, but then also going, like, working in Italy, and then, on a completely different matter, in a completely different culture. During those transitions, obviously there were hardships. I want people to kind of gain that. It's okay to work through those hardships. What were some of those hardships, and how did you get through them?
There's 1,000% hardships. I really am glad you bring that up, because I think there's this perception of, like, we all get that, right? Why is this so hard for me?
Right. Right.
And it's truly not. It's more that you're not seeing the hardships. They're not being talked about that for others. I think you hit the nail on the head. There's two different buckets, right? There's the first set of hardship is really knowing what you want, like knowing being able to put your finger on what's not working for you in that moment. And I think that takes some time, and it's okay to give yourself grace that you may feel frustrated and something's not really clicking for you and you don't know yet, like, what the next step is. And really sitting in that. I heard someone frame this one way, like, a week ago, where it's, are you frustrated most of the time, most of the days, for most of the months? And if you're just frustrated one day, 1 month, every 6 months, that's okay. That's normal life.
Right.
And I think when you're getting to the place where you really feel like, okay, this isn't clicking for me most of the time, most of the days, I think taking the time to say, okay, now what's at the heart of that? That was the first step that was challenging. And sometimes I didn't know for a minute, right? Like, I think even really between this big space, this big jump, moving back to California and re-exploring innovation, I frankly took some time to really step back and, like, process, like, all that I had learned over all the years, what really I loved, what really wasn't working for me. Then the second bucket of hardship is taking what you see, what you know you need to do, and realizing that. And sometimes that thing doesn't exist. And so you're trying to say, how do I take steps towards realizing it, even if it's not a slam dunk day one? And I think also giving yourself grace that you may not peel back the onion and achieve that thing the first time. You might need to take a step towards the step. You might have to have a little bit of patience, have to have a little bit of faith. I think I've had both. I've had the not sure what the next step is. And then I've had the, okay, I really want to do innovation in ocean, or I really want to do private sector startup in impact. How do I find that?
Yeah.
And I think in some ways it's grit. In some ways it's really, like, leveraging your network and reaching out to folks. You don't know what you don't know sometimes, right? You haven't heard of all the things. And I think also a little bit of it is like faith, right? Faith and patience. I don't think I could have envisioned that Finless existed when I started my director of policy job at an org that really worked on ocean innovation. But I was exposed to so many cool ecopreneurs in the camp of things I wanted to do that I put myself in the universe of which things would resonate with me, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So sometimes you just got to immerse yourself in the thing, and the potential and opportunities will present themselves to you.
Right.
And it's really about being open to jumping on opportunities when they come across your plate.
Right. So you had that opportunity to network with people who were doing these types of startups, or even established businesses that were very different, very innovative, working more towards a sustainable future or ethical future. Were you surprised by the amount of companies that were out there doing this type of work?
Again, 1,000%. To give ourselves some credit, me and you, maybe we're not the same age, maybe we're, when I first started my career, I truly love law and policy, so I'm so glad I have that experience, and I'm glad that I found an entrepreneurial space where I still do that, just from a different vantage point. But all that to say, I've had a mentor of mine say really early on, like, when we were coming of age in our careers, there were two ways to work on ocean impact: being a lawyer or policy person, or being a scientist.
Yeah.
And these opportunities like truly didn't exist when I graduated. Not only did I not know about them, but truly the amount of like social impact, entrepreneurship, impact centered business, ESG and business didn't exist.
Right.
And then you're right, being in this world, I like see how many different opportunities there are in different landscapes, from zero waste and reuse models to like clean energy and wave energy to fisheries, from a gear perspective and a technology perspective to like alternative seafood, like my world. I truly think that find your passion area and like immerse yourself in people and networks or accelerators that are doing that, and your eyes will be open to how much opportunity there actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I think we had the same kind of transition. I feel like when I grew up through university and through graduate work and through my career, when I first started, it was here's how the world is, with climate change and marine pollution or plastic pollution and marine pollution and overfishing and all this negative. Here's what we're doing wrong with the ocean. And I feel as though now a lot of organizations are still on that kind of train, like in the NGO space. But there are a lot of these innovative companies that are offering the solutions, even sort of the mindset, like, plant-based food. You're looking at, zero waste and things like that. But we're not making that transition very quickly. But here are these solutions being presented as, yes, we've done some pretty bad things to the planet. But now, instead of focusing on the negative, we should focus on how do we start moving people into the access to these type of companies.
Andrew, I'm obsessed that you're talking about this because I really had to hold my tongue to be patient to let you finish, because I think I know I'm sitting there. You can see me on video.
Yeah.
I think that was the actual straw, if you will, that moved me over to the entrepreneur side. In that,
right.
I was running this campaign, like combating things that were being done wrong, which 1,000% is important for our world. 1,000% is important for the paradigm. We 1,000% need it. But what I was always seeing was like, the way it's been structured is we're great at block and tackling, like impeding negative things that shouldn't happen, or trying to create ecosystems that prevent the like you said, the negatives that have happened. How do we start mitigating those? There wasn't this space to talk about, like, if this paradigm isn't working, what is the next paradigm? And what I always was saying to like my friends and whoever would listen really is, we need a world in which we do all the things we do today, but done differently in a way that's more sustainable. It's like the cars we drive to, or even if it is cars, to like what powers and fuels our electricity of our houses, to what we eat. Like, we have been built in an age in which sustainability wasn't a big part of the conversation of these goods and services becoming designed. And so I was like, how do we think about the positive paradigm shifts and the solutions we need to make those achievable? And how do I become part of that world? And it just felt like that isn't really the strength of what the government does. Like, even if they see the need for that, they create incentives, right? Like subsidies for EVs or subsidies for solar panels in your houses or tax breaks, but they're not the ones figuring out how to do it. They're not the ones being like, how do I create these most efficient solar panels?
Right.
At the end of the day, it's innovation, right? Like, that's how we turned a technology that now is our cell phone into our cell phone, rather than something that was created for something else. How did we commercialize it? And so I always said to myself, regardless of what I learn, regardless of what I achieve in actually, generating impact, I will now understand how hard it actually is to bring an innovative idea and a solution, like a positive paradigm shift, to life. And that in itself is invaluable, because it means I will be better at doing my job.
Yeah.
And that's always been really important to me. It's why I spent time in Italy. Folks were like, why are you at this tuna trap? And I was like, well, I want to legislate around tuna policy, so I better understand tuna fisheries and how tuna fishermen think and the real things that they're wrestling with. So I think it's similar for innovation, like just being on the ground floor, learning how hard it is to create a positive paradigm solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like I always use this example as, as a way to do new things is I was actually doing an interview with a friend of mine for this podcast a number of years ago, and he wrote a book on being a climate hero. And I was telling him, like, Canada, where I live and where he lived is we are based on an oil and gas economy. And I'm like, I'm like, how, and I'm like, people want all this money towards renewables, but how do we do this? And like, how is it going to happen? And he was basically, the answer is just like, wouldn't it be great if we could, though? Like, wouldn't it be amazing if we were able to just put all that money in there and not necessarily fully rely on that, but predominantly rely on that type of renewable energy? And it just it shifted my mindset to being like, instead of focusing on what was and what is and what the problem is focus on what could be, and putting more of that focus on there and more of that support on there. And I always like using that analogy because it puts me in a different mindset shift. And to do that, that's where I started to really take podcasting more seriously, trying to build this media company and trying to, expand it and get more, eyes on it, or in our case, ears on it, for people to listen to this, because I feel like it's important information to get that behavior change or work towards that behavior change without it feeling doing it for a guilty reason. It's like, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? Wouldn't it be great if we can not fully rely on wild seafood or aquaculture seafood, but there are alternatives out there? Wouldn't it be nice to have that? And I always loved that aspect. But to do that, I'm a scientist by education and 20-year career. I think in research terms. I think in, here's the problem, this is how you solve it, but there's a specific scientific method to follow that process. You went it from a law perspective. You have your policy and management sort of methodologies and so forth. Shifting to a business outlook is a lot different from a science perspective for me. I know law has a lot of it can transfer over to business easier, I feel. How, like, now you're a chief strategy officer, at Finless Foods. How was that transition from, law and policy to, looking from strategy from a business point of view to get this impact going? Because it's great that we have this impact and this great vision, but now there's business needs to be done, like through a business. So how did you find that transition?
Relieving, refreshing. I love it. I mean, I think the thing that was challenging for me about the policy space, and I still get to do a lot of policy work, which I love, right? Just from a different hat. Right. But I think from the world in which I was doing it, just the speed in which I get to work now, like the pragmatism, the whole goal every day is move the ball forward. You don't have to have 100% confidence in everything that's decided. You don't need to write an 80-page thesis before we float it to a group, before we decide to take the next step, before we maybe float it to the, right? It's a lot more, how do we practically and sort of like from a grounded level attack this challenge in front of us. Mm-hmm. And this is what I love about the startup world, in a short time frame. Like, right. How do we move the ball forward on the things we're trying to achieve in this, given the constraints we have, given the reality we have, and how do we just move the ball forward? And I love that, because like I said, I think what was frustrating for me was not feeling like I could be a builder and like see something that needs to be done and say, okay, I want to create that. And also in a lot of ways, the freedom of thought, if you will. I think what I wish we could transport the way that entrepreneurs and startups and innovators think about problem solving to policymakers, right? Where you don't have to poke holes in everything and have every assumption solved, and you can kind of have a more like freedom of thought in exploring what solutions could look like. Mm-hmm. And I really think that it really fits me and my personality much more. So for me, it's been quite liberating. Yeah, I can see that. I work in a business space, like for my full-time job, and you can see when you propose an idea and sort of the executives in my case like it, we go for it. Like, we just like, hey, let's put a plan together, and what are the deadlines here? Can we get this up and running in 6 months or less, and but still manage risk. So it's a faster pace, faster thinking.
but it can be risky at times in terms of doing things, but you tend to kind of move at a faster pace, which is very different from policy and
But in a lot of ways, with you saying about managing, there's 1,000% you're managing risk, but one thing my colleague says to me all the time, she'll probably listen to this and laugh that I'm saying it here, but fly a paper airplane and see what flies and see what doesn't. There's a lot more of this mentality of like, you hear from startups, right? Test, repeat, try again, test, repeat, shift, fail forward, learn by doing. Like failures aren't really failures. It's a chance to break it fast. There's much more of a applied growth mentality than there is in like a policy space where you really are trying to answer every single question on every single thing. And sometimes it's impossible to do that, right?
Right.
And so I think I like this sense of looking at the objective, looking at the constraints, trying to make your best guess, even trying to, in some ways, being like a scientist, set up little experimentations. We're going to try these three things. Then the one that floats is the one we're going to go with. I also think another colleague of mine, this is why you have to talk to your colleagues, a lot of learnings. Another colleague of mine at the climate change negotiation said to me, we really have to get past this idea that any innovation we invest in is going to be the success. And that even if some don't work, net, we're gaining by investing in innovations. And the reason I say that is going back to this mentality of like 3 experiments, which one works. You don't always know. And you're even learning, even if you have 3 experiments, you might decide 1 is the way to go, but you learned from 3 that thing didn't work, you bake it into 1. And I think this whole betting on the horse of the technology that's going to for sure work and drive XYZ exponential impact is holding us back because we really need to be trying a lot of innovations. We're trying to solve this complex, wicked challenge of like climate change and hitting carrying capacity of the ocean, et cetera. We need to be thinking about a lot of innovations and saying all these horses could be winners, even if they're in some percentage, a 15% winner or 10%. Net, that's still in the direction we need to go. And even if only 3 of the 10 horses are winners, we're 3 closer than 0. And if we all try and spend years picking the singular winner, we may not get anywhere. And I think that is the startup mentality versus where sometimes the policy thinking is. And I think that's why we've kind of been, if not moving backwards, treading in place, right? So
well, if you think about it too, it's almost like it's following the law of ecology, right? Where you have a diverse set of companies, right, that are trying to do one functional thing. So say you have a couple of, maybe you have like going back to your example, 10 companies, say in the plant-based seafood industry. Well, they have a function. They're there to offer these different products. Well, if one falls off, you have 9 others. If 5 fall off, you have 4 others that are still around that may succeed. It's the same thing in a coral reef habitat. If you have herbivores who are trying to eat algae, who are keeping the algae from overgrowing on the corals, if one of those species drop off, but there are 9 others around, you're not going to get much of a change. It's still going to be there. Diversity matters. Diversity is success. And so that works with business quite a bit, right? As it does in the natural world. And I think a lot of people, we don't think about it because usually it's like one company, say in the electric car space, the Tesla was the one that sort of became sort of the name, of EVs, and for good or bad, that's become the name. But there are a lot of other electric vehicle companies that are out there and that are emerging even now, building off maybe some of the technologies or some of the successes that it's other have. So we're getting a more diverse set of EVs around, which is quite nice. So I like that. I like using that analogy of the diversity because you do need a diverse set of startups, right?
And that's very much baked into our so going not even just alternative seafood or whether it's the plant-based space or the cell-cultured space. We often, not just Finless, although we really emphasize this, but I would generally say our industry talk a lot about rising tide lifts all boats because all of us really are mission founded and mission driven. And the real goal here is making this impact and reframing the way we've got our food culture and our food system and doing so in a way that prioritizes sustainability a lot more than it has been in the past.
Right.
And one, we need all of us to really shake up a food system and also even to hit production scale in which we could filter through to enough consumers and even put a dent in any type of demand model. At the same time, like you're saying, that diversity, there's diversity of products for different types of consumers. There's diversity in strategy. There's diversity just in terms of if there's 10 horses and eight win in this space, we're still net winning for the planet. And so I think it really is a reframe that's really important. Of course, you're in a business world. There's still competitors. Your investors still drive towards competition. In some ways, though, you really do see that model of does competition drive innovation? Like, do you run faster when you're running on your own on the trail, or do you run faster when you're in a race?
Right. For sure.
But at the same time, I think in the mission and impact business space, there's a really different mindset of winners and losers, because we're like, if any of us win, the planet's still winning.
True.
And I think especially when you're thinking about creating a new industry where we're all working together on regulatory frameworks and we're all working together on government relations and how can we build enabling systems that support innovative technologies, we're all building that system together. So in some ways, we're all part of the wins.
Yep.
And so I think that reframe is really, really important, because I don't know that the business world is seen to be that way in the past. And I think that is like a great evolution that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's success in a group. I like that in an industry. Now let's talk about this industry a little bit more. As you were transitioning for your from your career into this startup, why Finless Foods? Like, why this particular company? What was it? You mentioned there's an industry and there's a number of different startups within that industry. What was it that sold you where you could make the most impact with this company that's driving impact?
Yeah, I love this question. Andrew, this is so fun. Thank you for a Friday of fun, right? Leaning into the weekend. Like I said from the beginning, I always had this passion around bluefin tuna. And I think as a kid of the 80s, coming of age in the 90s, like the bluefin tuna saga was one that if you were in the environmental or ocean space, it was very close to if not to your heart, at least to your mind, right? And I think that's something that's really carried with me. And so Finless, like from the founding of Finless, was really working on an alternative supply of bluefin, which was just endlessly fascinating. We could have a whole podcast on that.
Absolutely.
The impact strategy there, the business strategy. At the same time, I'm still a policy geek at heart, even if I'm now playing in marketing and comms, and I'm someone who finds so much like joy. Yeah. Whether that's sad or not, I don't know. In policy.
It's typical. It's typical of someone in policy.
Right, in policy. And so what I loved about Finless is they were really focused really early on this walk the walk, not just talk the talk, and baking that into the business strategy. So everything from really early on, like when you always know in the world of a startup, it's like your early hires. The fact that there was an ocean policy law person hired in to really lead policy work says a lot, because it was seeing the value of someone who understood the sustainable seafood movement, who understood how to interact with civil society, who understood like the executive versus legislative branch in the government, understood intergovernmentals. And I think that priority said a lot to me. Also, when I joined, even early days, we had structured this thing called the Impact Advisory Board, which is taking like ocean experts, whether that's in sustainable seafood and had worked in the seafood industry, to conservationists, and put them on this board to say, we use you as a business strategy tool. We work with you and gain your insight into everything from what's the mission of Finless to what does our product innovation pipeline look like in terms of next species? How do we establish metrics, like impact metrics? And I think that showed a lot of vision to me. And so I think just that investment that Finless has always made into walking the walk, from the impact side and the engagement side and the systems change side, made it to me like the place I'd want to be. Not only because I really believe in what we're doing, but also because it allows me to do the things I love. So it's not really a trade-off. It's like an and. Getting to do the policy work and working with the Hill, and getting to, work with regulators internationally, and getting to work with civil society and think through like impact metrics, it's baked in.
Yeah, and it's such a mindset shift too. When you think about, you mentioned the policy and hiring people who are familiar with ocean policy, who've worked in that. I think a lot of times when you hear a company who has somebody that works with policy, you're thinking that that company is trying to shape the policy to benefit the company. Like in traditional sense, but in some like major companies, major corporations have had a very bad reputation for doing that.
Like data privacy or
even just sort of competition, getting it up on a competition and so forth. But here it really feels like a different way. It's like, no, hold on a sec. We just want to see how we're not trying to benefit our company. We're trying to see how our company can fit in, maybe help shape the policy to be more sustainable, but fit in so we can do a good job here. Like we can be part of the solution instead of just upping our company's price or what have you. And I really like that mind shift. It gives me good vibes all over. As a potential consumer in the future, it's like, no, I like this company, being able to do this, because now I want to see this company succeed because they're doing the right thing. They're doing what what we expect, and they're looking out for not only themselves, but they're looking out for the planet, which is something that we need to back.
Yeah, it's like, how do we use our company and our voice, and also just in a lot of ways our being able to be a convener to push forward this paradigm shift, where even if we're talking to policymakers, for example, it's not per se saying, hey, do this thing for Finless. Right. It's really, this is the paradigm shift in our food system that we really believe in, and this company working with us believes in, and this company works with us believes in, and how can we build an ecosystem where we're supporting a food system that's more varied and diversified and has sustainability at the heart of it, not only supporting the food system that has been since, 50 to 100 years ago. So it's really, I think of it as everything is kind of going towards this greater systems change, and it's how do we each use all of our voices collectively.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. So tell us about the model of Finless Foods. Tell us about the product and then how it's being distributed.
Yeah, great. So it's interesting. I actually don't know how many of your listeners have heard about this novel industry, so I'm kind of going to square one it a little bit.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
So I always like to say this because I think Finless is an alternative seafood company. The reason I say that is because we're producing and working on both plant-based seafood, which is what it sounds like, 100% made of plants, so technically vegan, to a cell-cultured bluefin tuna product. And that is this novel industry where you take a sample of cells from like a wild tuna, in this case, and you feed them all the nutrients that like you and I eat, or like a tuna eats in the wild, like protein, salt, sugars, amino acids, and the cells proliferate, like grow out in a production facility that some will say is maybe akin to like a brewery, where you see these big like silver drums. You harvest the cells and you can create a product that is comparable to the wild capture piece of, let's say, sashimi or sushi would be.
Right.
And so many companies are plant-based or cell-cultured, and Finless is both.
Okay.
And that's a really cool vantage point for us. I will say Finless was founded as a cell-cultured company. We were the first cell-cultured seafood company globally, and we produced the first sample of cell-cultured seafood to be consumed ever.
Wow.
And so that's very like heart and central to our, like everything from our mission to the team build out to our day-to-day work stream and what I work on, like regulatory pathway. At the same time, we probably around when I started, actually maybe 3 years ago, realized that there was this nascent white space for plant-based alternatives that were also in the seafood camp, not just sort of the burgers and nuggets, if you will.
Yep.
And through R&D, we had, because you're experimenting with different flavors and textures, et cetera, in the food science facility, and we realized like we actually could create a pretty decent, we think great, but a great plant-based poke-style tuna option.
Right. Yeah.
And it was a business decision to say, do we commercialize this? Do we become an alternative seafood company? Does this stay in the chronicles of R&D, right?
Right.
And Finless decided that we wanted to be a company that diversified options for consumers, ways for them to like meet their if you will, their interest in eating seafood dishes like poke or sushi, etc., with alternative options, whether that was a plant-based option for someone who is a vegan or is just trying to increase a few plant-based meals a week, or someone who has seafood allergies, to cell cultured options for us to diversify the supply of seafood to meet growing demand. And so anyway, we've been working on both. The plant-based, we've actually launched about 6 months ago at the end of May of last year at the National Restaurant Association show. And so we've been working on rolling that out to food service channels in the last 6 months. And it's something that's a big momentum push for us in 2023. And the cell cultured, we're like hard at work with R&D and prototyping and going through our regulatory approval process with the US government, FDA, and the Singaporean government with the SFA, their Singapore's food authority. And that's very different in terms of one not needing regulatory approval and one actually needing to go through a regulatory approval process.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That's so cool. And then so when you roll out this stuff, there's a lot of obviously regulatory pathways that you have to go through. Not only do you have to do a lot of ocean regulation with this kind of work? Like, is because there's no real impact on the environment when making this, like when you're creating this type of food, right?
It's a good question, though. It's something, again, for the regulatory nerds out there. I think the thing we think about a lot more with NOAA, for example, in the U.S., is, so NOAA is responsible for thinking about the seafood strategy. Right. So what is the strategy for sourcing seafood for the U.S. population, for its current demand and demand moving forward 10, 20 years?
Yeah.
So for the NOAA, like Oceanside, what we do is more have conversations and advocate that we need to broaden the way we think about our seafood strategy beyond just like, of course it's a main pillar. Let's think of it as a stool with 3 legs. Like, yes, wild capture is a main pillar. It will be. Aquaculture is a pillar that is and will be, and it's something the U.S. is really looking into advancing. And we say the third pillar should also be looking at these alternatives and broadening the sources of supply that we can pull from, especially just given the leveling out of wild capture fisheries, the innovation cycle that aquaculture is going through, and also just given the changes that we'll be seeing to the planet in terms of ocean carrying capacity, climate change, marine pollutants, et cetera. But more traditionally, in terms of like regulatory, what you think of is just pre-market like safety, making sure that what we produce will be safe to eat.
Yep.
And that the label will like clearly differentiate and describe what the product is and how it was produced. And in the U.S., that's really FDA.
Right.
For seafood specifically.
That makes sense because, I mean, people are not just going to eat something that they just heard of or, it's new to them. They want to make sure that it's safe. Now, one thing I've always found interesting with, when you look at the sort of the counterparts in the meat industry, there are people who are very pro sort of, beef, chicken, and so forth. And then there are people who are very, they like the alternatives, the plant-based alternatives. But it's from a public standpoint, like a PR standpoint, there seems to be a clear line for a lot of people. Some people won't even try plant-based. To me, I actually enjoy it. I enjoy a bean burger every once in a while and so forth. But do you find, or have you come across that same type of idea or thought process with the seafood industry? Like, I know a lot of people, just even from a very based on wild and aquacultured seafood, some people won't even eat aquacultured seafood. But from now we have this alternative as plant-based and cell cultured. Has there been that sort of resistance or challenge to that idea?
There's so many layers to this question. Here's an onion example.
Yeah, for
that
sure.
I enjoy to peel away. The reason I say that is I want to almost create 2 buckets, right? There's the consumer, the everyday person, and then there's the seafood industry. There's interesting things to say on both, but just to start with the consumer, I think there is, there's a lot of sort of editorializing in the media right now around plant-based. There's so many layers to the story. It really depends on the biggies, the Impossible and Beyonds versus all the other players, which there are many, many, many in the alternative space, in the plant-based space, and what folks are hearing on that. I think that is leading to a lot of opinions and confusion. But in terms of the actual, like who are we seeing consume these products, and what is the actual data saying, which is different than editorializing, is that we've gone are the days of everyone being super labeled about their food identity, like vegan, vegetarian, carnivore. I think like here are the days of conscious consumption, flexitarianism, reducitarianism, like, if you will, a lot more of a gray than a box approach.
Right.
And I say that because we are seeing that actually majority of folks who are eating plant-based options do also say they buy, like, purchase and consume like animal protein options. I think there's a lot more of this, how do we think about the impact of our food system and how do we flex our days? Like, how do I have a burger on a Monday but have a plant-based burger on a Tuesday? And I think that also comes with the rise of conscious consumption. Like, our choices have impacts. And that's very generational. It's why our plant-based tuna has been so successful in colleges and universities, because that generation is demanding that there's more sustainability considerations in their dining halls, that there's more health options in their dining halls, not just like the burgers and fries. And they're the ones demanding more plant-based alternatives. And so I think what we're seeing is, regardless of if you see yourself as one or the other, there's a space in your palate and your plate for plant-based options. I'm a perfect example in that, I'm a vegetarian married to a not vegetarian, so we've become flexitarian. We're always compromising. I definitely am less picky on if, like, there's a meat something in the dish. And he definitely really integrates and enjoys plant-based alternatives into our cooking at home frequently, multiple times a week. And then on the seafood industry side, it's actually really interesting. You really have to segment out the plant-based versus cell-cultured. On the plant-based side, I think that there's been a lot of, and I've been kind of engaging with the seafood industry since I started. And actually last week, I was at the National Fisheries Institute, which is the NFI, which is the Seafood Trade Association in the U.S. I was at their annual markets conference on a panel about the future of protein.
Nice.
Speaking about plant-based. And I think there's been growing, if you will, like, thought around this, and that early on, I think there was a reaction to the negative messaging that the plant-based companies were using against conventional industry, like basically selling your product on the negatives of another industry versus selling your product on the positives of what it brings people as a consumer. Also, the biggest discussion point that the seafood industry has around plant-based seafood is the labeling. It comes down to, are people understanding that plant-based seafood options are 100% made of plants? There is not seafood in them. They are vegan. And if that's the case, and it's adequately labeled, much of the seafood industry is like, consumer choice is consumer choice. If you would like to eat that, go for it, as long as you know what it is. More and more, you're also seeing seafood industry players like Thai Union, et cetera, Bumblebee, move into like partnerships or to build out their own plant-based lines. On the cell-cultured side, the seafood industry has been quite interested in this, and it's been only growing over the years, basically seeing this as a potential another source of supply of wild, what is now only constrained by wild capture seafood and also sometimes aquaculture. And so it's a space where there's been a lot of, if you will, intrigue, questions, watching and learning, and trying to see what the play is for the seafood industry in the space.
It's amazing. Yeah, I think there's so much to dive in. I mean, we could probably talk for multiple hours on where this space is going, and I think we will eventually have you back on to talk more about that if you're up for that. But
I love it.
What I want people to know here is like, this is a startup, but you've already started to, Finless Foods has already started to put some of the product into the market. Like, you've already started to sell it, but it doesn't necessarily go to individuals. Can you just kind of talk about how it's distributed right now?
Yeah, of course. So just to be super clear, our plant-based product is in sell-in. We're selling it into food service. Our cell-cultured bluefin tuna is undergoing regulatory, so that is not being currently sold. We hope to have it sort of out there for y'all to taste in the near future. On the plant-based side, just to explain, like, what is food service? Basically, which is just bringing it to the super basic level, most of the seafood, at least for the US, is consumed out of home, right? People go to a seafood restaurant, they go to seafood grab and go, they go to like a Whole Foods prepared food section. They're not per se like making sushi at home.
Right.
And so for that reason, Finless has decided with our plant-based poke-style tuna, the best route to kind of launch is into food service, which means selling into a distributor who sells to like a poke chain, or to a Sweet Green, or to a Tender Greens, right? Like locations where you can go and buy the product made. And so we've been working to build out distribution. We've launched with distribution last year, which I've heard is quite exceptional. And we've been building that out in the last 6 months. Nice. At the same time, we've been building out conversations with the like operators, the folks that make the purchase decisions and menu for the locations. And we've already seen some great exciting things, like Stanford has brought us in to a campus dining hall. Like Notre Dame University has as well.
Oh,
cool.
We're
in some conversations with very cool national chains that have been progressing pretty quickly given the sell-in time. And so we're confident that 2023 is going to be a big year for our plant-based tuna, and that will continue to move that out so that you can find it in more locations kind of near you.
That's amazing. And if you ever wanted to give us an update, you can let us know where, you know, a new chain or something where it's involved, and we'll let people know here on the podcast so they can try it out if it's close to them. Shannon, this has been such an enlightening podcast, this episode. I love it. I'm so happy we were able to arrange this. I wish we had done it sooner. I always say that, but I wish we had done it sooner, because this is something I think that, you know, it's a business that's completely new to the podcast. We knew it was out there, but I'm glad we got it explained. You explained it so well, and also just sort of the driving mission behind it too. I think that's what really, for us, that's what really counts for the listener base here. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and you know, giving us all this information and sharing and being so transparent. We just love it. It's such refreshing to have when we have businesses come on when they're so transparent. It's so nice to have that. So thank you so much, and also the advice, sort of the example you give for your career to you know, chasing that impact. I love that term that you mentioned earlier. So you know, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and we'd love to have you back on.
Yeah, Andrew, it was my pleasure. It was so much fun. I'm glad it was a Friday. It worked out, right?
Absolutely.
We got to enter into the weekend strong. I'm always happy to come back. I'd like to just, I guess, final thoughts to say to anyone listening who's interested in learning more, like, follow us on social. We can share this with Andrew so that you can circulate. Check out our website. Follow us on LinkedIn. We're always kind of out and about, going to different events and locations. And we're also always happy to have folks reach out about questions or how they can get involved, or if they want to ask me any questions about my career. I'm always happy to chat, and we're here to just, you know, expand the movement. So happy to help, and thanks for having us.
Thank you, Shannon, for joining us on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was such a pleasure to have you on. I'm looking forward to having you on again to see what advances you've made within the industry of plant-based and cell-cultured seafood, and how Finless Foods is doing. To be able to connect with a guest as quickly as Shannon and I were able to do doesn't happen a lot. I'm very fortunate that I've had great guests where we talk a little bit before to kind of tell them what my plan is for the episode. Initially, when I first talked to Shannon, I didn't really have that much of a plan other than, hey, I want to know more about the company. But once I found out more of her background, once I found out why she's ended up doing here, like what she ended up doing at this company, or how she ended up being at this company, that really made me interested, just because of what we cover here on the podcast, and how there's so many people who are looking for jobs, who are early career researchers that want to be able to get a career. We think that we have this idea of what the career path should look like, and then it always changes. And you can see in this example, this is an example of the same thing. It has how, you know, your career path meanders, and it could be because of the jobs that you're offered, or because of where your one job takes you to the next job, or even just how you think you want to chase the impact that you want. You may not get a full impact from one job, and you need to transition to another. And I think it was great to be able to hear those transitions and those pivots of how difficult they were sometimes, how easy they were sometimes. She had to move around quite a bit internationally. That's got to be a little bit of a problem too, like in places. So it's not easy to do that kind of work. And so I was glad that Shannon was able to talk about that and be able to say, hey, like, this is something that's not an easy thing to do, but I'm so happy that I went through this, because everything led up to what's happened here today in working with Finless Foods. And then, of course, we got into the company of Finless Foods, which is really, really interesting. I would love to try that food. I don't think 5 years ago, if you asked me to try, I'd probably say no way, no how. Now I'm like, this is actually kind of interesting. I think it's more of like me trying alternatives to like burgers and stuff at restaurants and at home, like the bean burgers I really enjoy, and other different plant-based meat or I guess fake meat or whatever you want to call it, alternatives. So I think it's really interesting to see these types of companies and industries kind of pop up and working towards something more sustainable in the future. So I'd love to hear what you think of Finless Foods and of this interview. You can contact me through just DMing me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, or you can email me at speakupforblue.com/contact us, or just go into the contact us page. But if you want to know more about Finless Foods, I'm going to put their website, I'm going to put all their social media sites in the show notes, and we can go from there. But I think this is a company to watch. They are a startup, so they're slowly getting into the markets, and you'll start to see their food pop up more and more through sort of like, as she mentioned, prepared foods type of industry. So take a look out. If you do try it, let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And I want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.